Chapter 15, Section 1. The Puzzle of Life's Diversity. Nature presents scientists with a puzzle. Humans share the earth with millions of other kinds of organisms of every imaginable shape, size, and habitat. This variety of living things is called biological diversity. How did all of these different organisms arise? How are they related? These questions make up the puzzle of life's diversity. What scientific explanation can account for the diversity of life? The answer is a collection of scientific facts, observations, and hypotheses known as the evolutionary theory. Evolution, or change over time, is the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms. A scientific theory is a well-supported, testable explanation of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. The individual who contributed more to our understanding of evolution than anyone was Charles Darwin. Darwin was born in England on February 12, 1809, the same day as Abraham Lincoln. Shortly after completing his college studies, Darwin joined the crew of the HMS Beagle. In 1831, he set sail from England for a voyage around the world. His route is shown in figure 15.1. Although no one knew it at the time, this was to be one of the most important voyages in the history of science. During his travels, Darwin made numerous observations and collected evidence that led him to propose a revolutionary hypothesis about the way life changes over time. That hypothesis, known now, is supported by a huge body of evidence and has become the theory of evolution. Wherever the ship anchored, Darwin went ashore to collect plant and animal specimens that he added to an ever-growing collection. At sea, he studied his specimens, read the latest scientific books, and filled many notebooks with his observations and thoughts. Darwin was well educated and had a strong interest in natural history. His curiosity and analytical nature were ultimately the keys to his success as a scientist. During his travels, Darwin came to view every new finding as a piece in an extraordinary puzzle, a scientific explanation for the diversity of life on this planet. Darwin's Observations. Darwin knew a great deal about the plants and animals of his native country, but he saw far more diversity during his travels. For example, during a single day in the Brazilian forest, Darwin collected 68 different beetle species, despite the fact that he was not even searching for beetles. He began to realize that an enormous number of species inhabited the earth. Patterns of diversity. Darwin was intrigued by the fact that so many plants and animals seemed remarkably well suited to whatever environment they inhabited. He was impressed by the many ways in which organisms survived and produced offspring. He wondered if there was some processes that led to such a variety of ways of reproducing. Darwin was also puzzled by where different species lived and did not live. He visited Argentina and Australia, for example, which had similar grassland ecosystems, yet those grasslands were inhabited by very different animals. Also, neither Argentina nor Australia were homes to the sorts of animals that lived in European grasslands. For example, these patterns pose challenging questions. Why were there no rabbits in Australia despite the presence of habitats that seemed perfect for them? Similarly, why were there no kangaroos in England? living organisms and fossils. Darwin soon realized that living animals represented just part of the puzzle posed by the natural world. In many places during his voyage, Darwin collected and preserved remains of ancient organisms called fossils. Some of those fossils resembled organisms that were still alive, as shown in figure 15-2. Others looked completely unlike any creature he had ever seen. As Darwin studied fossils, new questions arose. Why had so many of these species disappeared? How were they related to living species? The Galapagos Islands. Of all the Beagle ports of call, the one that influenced Darwin the most was a group of small islands located 1,000 kilometers west of South America. These are the Galapagos Islands. Darwin noted that although they were close together, the islands had very different climates. The smallest, lowest islands were hot, dry, nearly barren. Hood Islands, for example, had sparse vegetation. The higher islands had greater rainfall and a different assortment of plants and animals. Isabella Island had rich vegetation. Darwin was fascinated in particular by the land tortoises and the marine iguanas in the Galapagos. He learned that the giant tortoises varied in predictable ways from one island to another, as shown in figure 15-3. The shape of a tortoise shell could be used to identify which islands a particular tortoise inhabited. Darwin later admitted in his notes that he did not for some time pay sufficient attention to this statement. Darwin also saw several types of small, ordinary-looking brown birds hopping around looking for seeds. As an eager naturalist, he collected many specimens, several of which are shown in figure 15-4. However, he did not find them particularly unusual or important. As Darwin examined the birds, he noted that they had differently shaped beaks. He thought that some of the birds were wrens, some were warblers, and some were blackbirds, but he came to no other conclusions at first. The journey home. While heading home, Darwin spent a great deal of time thinking about his findings, examining different mockingbirds from the Galapagos. Darwin noticed that individual birds collected from the islands of Florida looked different from those collected on James Island. They also looked different from individuals collected on other islands. Darwin also remembered that the tortoises differed from island to island. Although Darwin did not immediately understand the reason for these patterns of diversity, he had stumbled across an important finding. Darwin observed that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably among the different islands of the Galapagos. And remember, the only difference in the Galapagos Islands are the climates. After returning to England, Darwin began to wonder if animals living on different islands had once been members of the same species. According to this hypothesis, these separate species would have evolved from an original American ancestor species after becoming isolated from one another. Was this possible? If so, it would turn people's view of the natural world upside down. All right, guys, just a couple of pointers on this chapter, on this section. Okay, number one, this chapter is beginning your introduction to evolution. Okay, and what you needed to understand is that the earth has enormous diversity. What that means is that there are millions of different species on this earth. So what the scientists in that study evolution want to study is how did we get so much diversity, different organisms, different types of living things on this earth. All right? And also, make sure you understand that Charles Darwin was the scientist, okay, that's almost considered the father of evolution, okay? And in his journey to the Galapagos Islands is where he gathered all his observations, okay, that allowed him to make the hypotheses to create his theory of evolution. What was so special about the Galapagos? Remember that all these islands were very close together, but yet every island had a different climate. Some were hot, some had no vegetation, some had very little vegetation, some had a lot of vegetation. Okay, that means lots of plants. Some had little plants, some of them didn't have any plants. Okay, and also what he saw was that on every island he saw different species. The organisms were different. For example, the tortoises, the giant tortoises. Okay. If you went to different islands, okay, the tortoises looked different. Their shells were different. If you look at the picture, their necks were different. Some had long necks, some had short necks, some had medium-sized necks. Why was that? Okay. Also, finally, what he started to think about as he was going home was maybe could it have been that all these different species, okay, evolved from one ancestor, meaning that one species, okay, evolved, and from that one species you got a bunch of different species, okay? And how could that be? What would cause that to happen? So make sure you keep in mind of these critical points in the chapter. If you need to re-listen to the podcast, okay, I suggest you do so to help you understand these concepts.